I really, really need, I think there's a Foucault on the shelf somewhere.
Right. Okay, so Dr. Johnston, welcome to the Rex and Alan from the Left. Here we will interview you on the topic of Foucault, especially on his regard for the political power and repression. In fact, Foucault discusses the role of sexual repression in society. What is the root of its power to control and manipulate?
Okay, so I guess where I'd start is by changing the frame just a little bit for Foucault. One of the things that Foucault is really trying to do in the first volume of History of Sexuality is to complicate and I think ultimately to reject the repressive hypothesis that sort of the popular framework for understanding sexuality in the West.
So what is the repressive hypothesis?
What Foucault's talking about, when he looks at discussions about Victorian sexuality, and so Freud here would obviously be an important intellectual in a scholarly discussion of sexuality. And not to go into a long discussion of Freud, but repression plays a very important role in Freud's analysis, both of how culture works and about sexuality, and the primacy of sexual repression in terms of human development. Foucault goes in and looks at that historical period, and what he sees isn't properly, in his mind, repression. And what's really important here is that Foucault is trying to reconceptualize particular forms of power in modern societies. He's not saying that power is never repressive, let's say in the Weberian sense of the state having a monopoly on the legitimate use of force. Foucault wouldn't argue with that. Of course they do, right? Because the state controls the military, the state controls the police. Who gets to carry guns and kill people and not go to jail? Soldiers and cops, right?
Right.
Who gets to decide, if the state puts someone to death, it's not murder, it's justice, right? Okay, so he wouldn't argue with that. His point is that it is not the most prevalent, fundamental form of power that's in operation in modern societies, right? And that theme runs through all of his work. And so you get snapshots of what is it looking like in particular situations and how is he advancing that argument. Happens differently in Madison's Civilization versus Discipline and Punish versus the History of Sexuality. Okay? In the History of Sexuality, with regard to sexuality, what Foucault's particularly interested in is he talks about the incitement to discourse, right, as a way to get at how power is working and the way power works to construct subjectivities. Right? So it isn't just a gigantic no. Right? We tend to talk about, particularly in the United States, right, there is this common perception that Americans are sexually repressed. Gigantic no to sex. It looks like that sometimes. Right? If you think about the cultural agenda of the far right, it looks like they're sex-phobic. Right? And they are definitely certain types of sex-phobic. The point what Foucault starts to try to direct our attention to, though, is that it isn't a no to sex in the generic, right? There's what he actually sees is an explosion of discourse that is discussions about sexuality. Sexuality becomes medicalized. So there becomes specialized medical fields in terms of diagnosing what is proper and improper modes of sexual action and expression. Right? There is panic in Victorian society about masturbation, right, for adults and for children. There is a way that discourse about masturbation sexualizes childhood, right, and actually extends the reach of power around sexuality, right? It doesn't so much happen as the no, as it happens through these discourses, in this case scientific and psychoanalytic, among others, that mean that you need to think about, am I a properly functioning sexual subject? Not just, hey, I think I'd like to have sex. That looks like someone I can have sex with, I think I'll do it. Over, done, back to what else you're doing. But that sexuality itself becomes an identity, and it wasn't prior to this point. Right? It was an act, it was something you did. I mean, the classic line from History of Sexuality, Volume 1, is that it is the transformation from the sodomite, which was focused on an action. It was an act. That act may have been censored, right? May have been punished, but it was an act. To the homosexual, who is an entire persona, who is an entire that permeates the entire being. You aren't anything else. You are just that thing.
It's an objectification of the person from the act.
It's an identity category rather than something you do. You are it versus doing it. So it becomes ontological.
Right.
You are it. You don't just do it. And what he sees as a historical rupture is that identity formation around sexuality. And he sees that as an extension of power, as a really important form of power, and really regulatory. That you have to answer. Think about it. I mean, we take it for granted. But it's a strange thing to have to do in public with people you do not know intimately, that somehow they ought to know what kind of sexual action you engage in.
Right.
That's a weird kind of regulation, and it isn't precisely repression in the sense of no. It's a form of power that demands an accounting. It demands that you pay attention to what's going on with yourself, and you can categorize it, and you can, right? And so what he focuses on then, in terms of what are these dynamics of power, that he really maps out in the first volume of History of Sexuality, which is not the totality of what he does. But he focuses on the confessional, right? And he links that psychoanalytic confessing to the therapist to the Christian confessional, right? So he sees this longer history of how has this worked and how has sex been deployed. If you read that text, he uses the word deployment. So it isn't the act, right? There's a way that the history isn't on the act, it's on the social cultural configuration and the way power is at work through those discussions. What happens? What can you do if you make people confess about sex? And it doesn't really matter if they confess to a priest or to a psychiatrist.
The discourse is relatively the same.
The discourse is relatively the same, and the regulation is the same. And so Foucault is among a host of theorists that, like Althusser, who was his teacher, who start thinking about power operating not just through the state. Right? So Althusser talks about ideological state apparatuses, right? And education is one of those. Foucault doesn't use that language, but he is interested in the way that power is at work in different types of social situations, not just in a straightforward economic exchange in the way that we focus on in Marxism, not just in terms of the state.
Right. Okay. So I'll end the first piece here, and the second piece will come later on.